He defeated Hitler, but killed millions of his own people. Joseph Stalin didn't just rule the Soviet Union. He reshaped it with fear, blood, and iron. Behind the parades, the propaganda, and the portraits of smiling workers was a machinery of control so vast, so calculated, that it turned an entire nation into a stage of silence. To understand Stalin is to step into a world where survival meant obedience, and sometimes even that wasn't enough. Before the name Stalin struck fear into millions, he was Ioseb Jugashvili, a poor boy from Georgia. The son of a cobbler and a deeply religious mother, young Joseph entered a church seminary in Tiflis. But it wasn't salvation he found. It was revolution. He began reading Marxist literature, abandoned religion, and joined the underground Bolshevik movement. While Lenin was the face of the Russian Revolution in 1917, Stalin remained in the shadows, quiet, calculated, and ambitious. He wasn't a great orator like Trotsky. But what he lacked in charisma he made up for in strategy. When the Civil War ended and Lenin's health declined, Stalin maneuvered behind the scenes, building alliances within the Communist Party. He took the seemingly dull position of General Secretary, then used it to appoint loyalists and sideline enemies. By the time Lenin died in 1924, Stalin had already laid the groundwork. He outmaneuvered Trotsky and other rivals with quiet ruthlessness. Within a few years, Stalin had consolidated power. The Soviet Union would never be the same. This isn't just a story about one man. It's about how power, when unchecked, can twist ideals into instruments of terror. What makes Stalin terrifying isn't that he was unpredictable, but that he was precise, cold, bureaucratic, and often popular. If you're interested in stories that challenge what we think we know about history, stories that reveal the hidden costs of power, then you're in the right place. Please like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss the truths others won't tell. Because the story of Stalin is just beginning. When Joseph Stalin took control of the Soviet Union, he promised transformation. He would drag a backward, agrarian empire into the modern age, through force if necessary. For Stalin, industrial progress wasn't just a goal. It was a war. And like any war, it demanded sacrifice. In 1928, Stalin launched the first five-year plan, a sweeping program to industrialize the USSR. Factories rose where none existed. Entire cities were built in months. Steel, coal, and electricity production soared. Trains moved faster, mines dug deeper, and smokestacks filled the skies. On paper it was success. But on the ground the cost was staggering. To fund industrial growth, Stalin turned to the countryside. He forced millions of peasants into collective farms, stripping them of their land, their livestock, and their autonomy. Resistance was crushed. The wealthier peasants, branded as kulaks, were labeled enemies of the state. Many were executed. Others were deported to Siberian labor camps. Then came the famine. Between 1932 and 1933, a man-made famine swept across Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and parts of southern Russia. Known as the Holodomor in Ukraine, this famine was not an accident of nature. It was policy. The state seized grain for export while villagers starved. Armed officials raided homes, taking hidden food and punishing entire communities. Estimates vary, but at least 3 to 4 million people died in Ukraine alone. Stalin never visited the affected regions. He dismissed reports of mass death as exaggeration or sabotage. Foreign journalists were silenced, and Soviet propaganda insisted that the country was thriving. Meanwhile, the state continued to boast of record production. The achievements were real, so were the graves beneath them. In the name of progress, Stalin turned peasants into prisoners, villages into statistics, and suffering into silence. The Soviet Union became an industrial power, but at the cost of millions of lives. What makes this history more chilling is that, for many inside and outside the USSR, Stalin was praised. He was seen as strong, decisive, and visionary. But beneath that image lay a foundation built on bones. The industrial miracle was not born of innovation, it was born of fear. By the mid-1930s, Joseph Stalin no longer had rivals, only imagined threats. And for those, he had a solution: terror. Between 1936 and 1938, the Soviet Union entered one of its darkest periods, the Great Purge. Also known as the Great Terror, it was a campaign of political repression so vast, so systematic that no one, no matter how loyal, was beyond suspicion. It began within the Communist Party itself. Prominent Bolsheviks who had fought beside Lenin were arrested, accused of treason, and forced to confess in public show trials. The charges were often absurd: spying for foreign governments, conspiring with fascists, or plotting to assassinate Stalin. Their confessions were scripted, extracted under torture or threats to their families. Once declared guilty, they were executed, often the same night. But the terror did not stop at the top. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, spread fear across the entire country. Quotas were set for arrests and executions. Neighbors informed on neighbors. Children were encouraged to denounce parents. People were taken from their homes in the middle of the night. A knock at the door became a symbol of death. Over 1.5 million people were arrested. Around 700,000 were executed. Many more were sent to Gulags, a sprawling network of forced labor camps in remote areas like Siberia and the Arctic North. There, prisoners toiled in brutal conditions, building railways, mining coal, or simply struggling to survive. The purges decimated the Soviet military, removing hundreds of experienced officers. Scientists, artists, teachers, anyone with independent thought, lived in fear. Entire ethnic groups, including Poles, Koreans, and Germans, were targeted in ethnic operations carried out under Stalin's direct orders. The logic was circular. If you were arrested, you were guilty. If you weren't, it was only a matter of time. Stalin didn't just use terror to eliminate threats. He used it to reshape reality. People began rewriting their own pasts, erasing friends, altering memories. Fear became a form of loyalty. The entire nation learned to whisper, to forget, to obey. The purge was not a breakdown of the system. It was the system, working exactly as Stalin intended. When Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa in 1941, invading the Soviet Union with over 3 million troops, the world watched to see if Stalin's regime would collapse. Instead, the Soviet Union, under Stalin's command, became one of the most decisive forces in Hitler's defeat. But the path to victory was paved with chaos, sacrifice, and silence. Stalin had ignored early warnings of a German invasion. Even his own spies who confirmed Hitler's plans were dismissed. When the Wehrmacht crossed into Soviet territory, it shattered unprepared Soviet forces. Millions of soldiers were captured or killed in the first few months. Stalin disappeared from public view for days, paralyzed by shock. But when he returned, he did so with iron resolve. He declared a great patriotic war, rallying the nation with calls to defend the motherland at any cost. And cost it did. Nowhere was that cost more visible than in Stalingrad, the turning point of World War II. Soviet soldiers were ordered not to retreat. NKVD officers were stationed behind them with orders to shoot deserters. The battle turned into a grinding, urban hell. By the end, nearly 2 million people were dead, but the Soviets had held the line. And for that, Stalin's image was recast, not as a tyrant but as a savior. Western allies, desperate for a strong Eastern front, embraced this version of Stalin. He was invited to Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam, sitting alongside Roosevelt and Churchill, shaping the post-war world. His crimes were conveniently ignored. To many outside the USSR, he was simply the man who broke the Nazi war machine. Inside the Soviet Union, the propaganda machine went into overdrive. Stalin's cult of personality deepened. Portraits showed him in uniform, stern yet fatherly. Children were taught to revere him. Streets and cities bore his name. Histories were rewritten to exaggerate his genius, erasing failures and elevating myth. But beneath the medals and parades, fear remained. Soldiers returning from German captivity were sent to gulags, accused of betrayal. Ethnic minorities suspected of disloyalty during the war were deported en masse. Loyalty to Stalin was still enforced, not by admiration but by control. World War II gave Stalin global legitimacy. It allowed him to mask the terror with triumph. But for millions the war never ended, it only changed form. On March 5, 1953, Joseph Stalin died after suffering a stroke. He lay incapacitated for hours, surrounded not by loyal aides, but by fearful subordinates too afraid to act without orders. Even in death, his grip on power lingered. The man who ruled the Soviet Union for nearly 30 years, through terror, war, and silence, was gone. But his shadow remained. Millions flooded the streets for his funeral. People wept, genuinely or performatively, no one could be sure. His body was embalmed and placed beside Lenin's in the mausoleum. The cult of Stalin had become so deeply embedded that his death didn't feel like the end of a leader, it felt like the collapse of a world. But cracks quickly formed. In 1956, just 3 years later, his successor Nikita Khrushchev stunned the Communist Party with a secret speech denouncing Stalin's crimes. He detailed the purges, the executions, the cult of personality, and the grotesque abuses of power. The silence was broken. The myth was shattered, at least briefly. Streets were renamed. Statues came down. Books were rewritten. The Soviet state began a cautious process of de-Stalinization, but it was incomplete. Some continued to revere him as a symbol of strength. Others saw him only as a tyrant. The truth, as always, was more difficult, because it lived in contradiction. Stalin modernized the Soviet Union, led it to victory against Nazi Germany, and turned it into a global superpower. But he also oversaw one of the most brutal regimes in modern history. Tens of millions died from famine, purges, executions, and forced labor. And many more lived in fear, silence, and denial. Even today in modern Russia, Stalin's legacy is contested. Some admire him as the architect of Soviet power. Others remember him as a murderer in a military uniform. Polls show a divided nation, torn between pride and pain, nostalgia and horror. What makes Stalin's story so disturbing is not just the scale of suffering, it's how much of it was hidden, normalized, or even applauded. Power didn't just corrupt Stalin. It reshaped the people around him, warped institutions, and blurred the line between loyalty and survival. His life is a warning that tyranny doesn't always come with chaos. Sometimes it comes with order, applause, and the illusion of progress. And sometimes it comes with silence,